Hello everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Today I'm going to talk about the problem with revenge. The common response to injustice will be to give an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. This principle is called the lex talionis, which is the idea that what has been done to you should be done to that other person. Jesus quotes Exodus chapter 21 verse 24, Leviticus chapter 24 verse 20, and Deuteronomy chapter 19 verse 21, which all reference the lex talionis. The point of this law was not to give you permission for personal vengeance. It was a law to establish a judicial system where a punishment fits the crime. The problem during Jesus' time was that a law meant to prevent personal retribution was used as a justification to get personal retribution. Ideally, if somebody hurt another person, then he or she will receive a punishment that is appropriate to that crime. It wouldn't be fair that the punishment for stealing a penny is the same for murder, right? But what happened was that the courtrooms were influenced by the rich and powerful. People with power would not experience the appropriate consequences for their crimes because they could bribe the judge to lessen their punishment. Since this was a widespread problem, people who were desperate for justice would take justice into their own hands. But look at what Jesus adds. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. Not only did Jesus say not to demand justice, but also to not to resist people when they do evil against you. Jesus is often quoted as opposing personal retaliation, which is the Old Testament law taught in Leviticus chapter 19 verse 18, and Proverbs chapter 20 verse 22. This is why Paul says in Romans chapter 12 verse 19, not to avenge yourself, and that vengeance belongs to God. But Jesus goes further. Not only should you refrain from personal vengeance, but also don't resist the evil person. Think about what Jesus just said. We agree that there should be justice, but Jesus says that a truly righteous person will not defend himself. Now, we might think that Jesus is being naive. Society would not function if everybody just let everything go. It's okay you murder my wife, I'll just let it go. But keep in mind, Jesus is not saying that there should be no justice. Jesus still expects governments to execute justice on people who do evil things. What he is referring to, though, is personal retribution. In other words, when the courts fail you, which they will in a broken world, do not try to get justice for yourself. Instead, let the other person have his own way and don't fight them. Why? Because justice is in God's hands. Jesus is not going to illustrate this principle. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, what is Jesus saying here? Let people punch you around? That's not what he is saying. Jesus is using an illustration about honor. During this time, slapping another person's cheek was such a serious insult that a person could take that other one to court. The Hammurabi Code talks about penalties for slapping a person's cheek with the punishment of cutting off that person's ear. The crime was not the physical injury. The crime was about dishonoring a person. But I want you to notice something about the slap. Jesus says if anyone slaps you on the right cheek. Now, most people during this time were right-handed. So to slap somebody on the right cheek with your right hand, how do you have to slap? With the back of your hand. And to slap a person with the back of your hand required double the financial punishment than a person who slaps you normally. So Jesus is painting a picture of a person who dishonors you to the worst degree during that time. How should you respond? Turn the other cheek. In other words, don't fight for the financial payment that you are owed in court. In a culture that was driven by honor and shame, this type of response will require a type of sacrifice that was almost impossible to do. So Jesus continues, and if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. This illustration is taking place in a courtroom. A person is suing you for a certain amount of money. If you didn't have that amount, then you would have to give up your tunic or shirt in court as collateral. This law applied to poor people who didn't have extra money to give as collateral, so they will have to give their tunic. But it will be unheard of for a person to give his cloak or jacket as well. In fact, poor people needed that cloak to sleep at night, and God's law said it was illegal to take a poor person's cloak as collateral. But notice what Jesus says. He says that his followers should be willing to give up what is legally and rightfully theirs, even if they are poor. Jesus provides another illustration. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Whereas the previous picture talks about surrendering what we own, this illustration is to surrender what we are owed. Now, this picture refers to when a Roman soldier or some government official summoned you to do some work. In the Roman Empire, the Roman soldiers had the right to enlist any person for forced labor, usually to carry the soldier's bag or to help carry supplies. This was the case when Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry Jesus' cross. Roman soldiers would often summon you to do work as a power trip to remind you that you must submit to them. Jesus takes the most distasteful example for Jews and says to go above their requests they ask from you. If they force you to walk a mile carrying their supplies, go another mile. Listen, Jesus is not talking about your friend asking you to do a favor. He's talking about an oppressive government humiliating you and forcing you to do something. Now, if you think these illustrations are shocking, Jesus concludes with the final illustration. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who will borrow from you. This picture is talking about giving money to those in need. The difference between giving and lending was the possibility of being paid back. But even the lending in this picture was understood to be given to those who might not have the ability to pay you back. If you loaned a person money and they didn't pay back the full amount within 7 years, you were obligated to forgive the remaining balance according to God's law. Also, the Old Testament law required interest-free loans to the poor so you wouldn't profit from them. So Jewish people were very careful about who they lend money to. They started to avoid poor people because they knew they probably wouldn't be paid back fully. But Jesus says that his kingdom citizens should not calculate or think about the person who is asking you for money. His kingdom citizens are so generous that they lend without expecting anything in return. Now, our natural response to this picture is that it is very impractical. Listen, Jesus is not saying his disciples must give endless amounts of money to everyone. Jesus is not saying we shouldn't have banks who charge interest on a loan. He is not saying that there shouldn't be police or military to fight evil with some violence. Instead, these 4 pictures shows us what it looks like to love our neighbors and our enemies as Christ loved us. These are not prescriptions meant to replace our government, but principles to how we, as Jesus' kingdom citizens, are to deal with others on an individual basis. Let us not forget that Jesus gives us an example of how this looks. When government officials spat on him, blindfolded him, and hit him in the face, Jesus turned the other cheek. When they took his shirt, he let them take his cloak too. And Jesus gave us the gift of salvation without charging us interest. You see, even if we were to get revenge, that will not satisfy our thirst for justice. We will only be satisfied when Jesus establishes perfect justice in his kingdom. But until that day comes, we surrender our rights to love others just like Jesus did. Thank you to today's sponsor, On Reverence. They offer a free digital worship music app called Maskill. If you want to find out more, I'll leave some links below in the description box. If you missed the last video about the problem of making promises, I'll leave a link here for you to watch. And until next time, see you.